Mara Hvistendahl, welcome to the Realignment.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Good to see you, Mara.
Good to see you.
So last year, your book, The Scientist and the Spy, a true story of China, the FBI, and industrial espionage, was actually one of our favorite reads. I got it on Audible literally right before our lockdowns happened. So the two of us actually went through and listened and really enjoyed it. And the part that I want to make clear here to everyone is also one more thing to make clear. It's in our bookshop. Definitely go check it out. A bunch of you have already purchased the book. Got some great questions. We were actually going to ask Mara directly from that there. But what I enjoyed so much about the book is that there was pretty much something for everyone when it came to the ideological spectrum. So if you're on the right, China, industrial espionage, there's that conversation which you could fit into your narratives. But if you're coming more from a center or left perspective, you do have a very frank conversation about discrimination and a lot of really, frankly, horrible behavior is an understatement going back to the 50s and 60s during the excesses of the Cold War. So this is clearly a story from my perspective that is going to just not just leave everyone satisfied. So it'd be good to start here. How would you define or explain the narrative you are trying to have the reader take away with?
Sure. Well, I'm so glad that you really liked the book. That means a lot. It was a busy year. It came out in February 2020 amid a lot of other news. The Scientist and the Spy is at its core a very simple story. It starts with a man named Mo Hailong, or Robert Mo, who was found in a cornfield outside Des Moines. And it was a Monsanto cornfield, and the corn growing there was protected as a trade secret. And so his appearance there set off this 2-year FBI investigation involving car chases, airplanes flying overhead as surveillance planes, the use of a FISA warrant at one point. And so it's at its core about this one investigation. And I wanted to get into why the potential theft of corn had set off this massive response, and also some of the underlying technological tensions between the US and China. But it's also about these broader issues. Over the past 10 years, there have been dozens of investigations involving often ethnic Chinese scientists in the United States. This is something that started under the Obama administration, but that really accelerated under the Trump administration. And so it's a much broader issue, but I wanted to tell it through this very kind of colorful and at times comical story.
Yeah. So to put some meat on the bones for readers who aren't deep into Monsanto and Iowa agriculture policy, why is a plant seed, or in that form, why is that a secret? And then why is that something that the U.S. government is getting involved with when it comes to the broader conversation about the U.S. and China?
Well, to make hybrid seeds, most of which are now genetically modified, it takes 5 to 8 years of intensive research. So companies like Monsanto, but also smaller seed companies, spend lots of money and lots of time developing these seeds. I'm not going to bore everyone with the whole process, but you need 2 parents. You need to develop each of those parents. Then you need to breed them out over several generations. And so this is something that companies spend a lot of money on. Now, where there's been a shift is that typically companies in the US would, if they suspected that someone had stolen their trade secrets, they would go to court. And it would be a civil case. They would sue the other company. But in the past few decades, the act of a foreign country or a company that is tied to a foreign government, sometimes even just in a foreign country, stealing a trade secret has been heavily criminalized. And so now these cases are being brought by the US government, and the FBI is devoting massive resources to investigating them. And then the US government is also devoting quite a lot of resources to prosecuting them.
It really is just such an amazing story, and the way you tell it, I mean, it's just narratively is perfect because it's like it starts with this guy getting stopped by what was it? It was like an Iowa State trooper or something like, right? Or some
Yeah,
highway patrol.
sheriff's
Yeah.
deputy.
And he's
He
like,
was,
what are these guys doing out here? This just seems weird.
yeah.
Happens to write down the name, and it all connects, and it goes in this big thing. But that's kind of why I loved it, because it was like the human representation of something that we've talked a lot here about the podcast, and actually really in the last several years about industrial espionage, the U.S. peer competition with China. It was cool to actually see it in practice and on a broader level, because I mean, like Xi Jinping was involved at one point in your story. I was like, what? Like, yeah, it's like cameos of everybody. So let's actually just get to, I guess, the bones of what we talk about a lot here, which is that, look, U.S. peer competition with China is going to be literally was, I think, the defining story of the Trump era that will live on, if anything, outside of the nonsense, and at least 4 years, 10 years, whatever, in the minimum. Do you think we're in a Cold War with China right now?
Uh, it's certainly starting to look that way. Yes. I mean, it will be interesting to see what happens under the Biden administration, but I think certain issues are not going away. And as I show in the book, these tensions they first showed up decades ago, but they
Right.
really started to escalate under the Obama administration. And, some of the same officials who were in charge of this effort to prosecuting economic espionage cases under the Obama administration are now in the Biden administration. So I think it's not going away. What is new in the past few years is there's been a lot of pushback from Chinese American groups and scientists who feel like they're being targeted unfairly, and they're really pushing to have a dialogue with DOJ. There's a sense that there's an overreaction to this issue. And, I started, my background is that I was a reporter in China for many years.
Mhm.
I was primarily a science reporter, and I worked for the journal Science. And so when I started reporting this book, I was fairly agnostic on what I was going to find, but I was just kind of curious about what was going on with these so many cases involving Chinese scientists, and the fact that my beat was like suddenly international news. For
Geopolitics. Yeah.
yeah, it had felt like a very niche beat before that, and so I don't think we're going to go back to this era where people could just kind of freely cross borders and have scientific cooperation without more scrutiny on what that means. But these issues are very complicated because, unlike in the Cold War of the 60s, we are now so intertwined with China, and our universities are intertwined, our people are intertwined. Our companies are very deeply invested in some ways. And, one issue, like Monsanto, for example, before they got interested in the issue of industrial espionage, they were trying very hard to get into the Chinese market. And, we have the situation where in China, companies are somewhat independent, but they are ultimately beholden to the Chinese government.
Right.
And in the United States, I mean, we have a lot of issues with corporate donations and corporate influence, but at the end of the day, U.S. companies are not beholden to the U.S. government, and they're beholden to their shareholders. And often their interests are it's just a cliche, but it's very true that their interests are sometimes in conflict with the interests of the country or human rights interests. And, in China for many years, companies went in trying to make money, hoping to get just a piece of the pie. And then when it turned out that they weren't going to get that, that they were being kept out of the market, you saw the sudden shift to big corporations really hammering on this issue of industrial espionage and saying, now we're being, now suddenly we care about this issue. And there is a certain hypocrisy in that.
Mhm.
So the immediate question, actually, million different questions come to mind. The first of which is what would you say the lesson, if we can stipulate that there's a possibility that we could be in the midst of a second Cold War, what are the lessons from the first Cold War as relate to the topic of this issue? Because I think everyone listening to this podcast, we can all agree that no one wants Joseph McCarthy 2.0. No one wants the HUAC HUAC House. I'm not
HUAC.
even bothered.
Yeah.
HUAC. Yeah, but
Un-American
what is,
activities.
yeah, there we go.
There we go.
Right.
I got it.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. No one, actually, I don't want to say no one, but we on this call don't want that. But at the same time, there actually was a serious Soviet espionage threat. So how do we balance those two things? Because the one thing I would also add to your point about how this is different from the U.S.-Soviet relationship is that there is a racial component to this. Kieran Skinner, a Trump administration official who was in charge of policy planning at the State Department, made a very controversial statement that I think was terribly phrased, a little historic and inaccurate, which was, this is the first time the U.S. has faced a rival power if it is not Caucasian. Now, that isn't true, like insert Japan. Mm-hmm. But the broad point, though, I think from a messaging perspective is true, which is that there's a dynamic here. You could have issues of Soviet spies, and it wouldn't racialize or lead to the same potential discrimination that you could see today. So I'd just love to see your broader takeaway on what do we learn from the Soviet era.
Well, even going back to that era, there were, conflict with China was obviously a big issue as well. And Chinese scientists faced a lot of scrutiny in that day as well. The difference is that many of the researchers who were then living in the US had actually fled China before 1949 and had ties to the Kuomintang and really had no plans to go back to China.
So just to be clear for people who don't know, Kuomintang was like the nationalist Chinese government.
Right, not the communist.
Yeah, right.
But, then as now, they were targeted by the Chinese government. The US was aware that there was this desire in China to really build up its technological talent, in part by recruiting people back to China. And so the response wasn't really the wrong way of dealing with it, which is just to blanket surveil almost everybody of Chinese descent who was doing research in the United States. And so this is something in the book, I tell this story of the kind of wacky seed case that involves airport busts and like smuggling of corn seed back to China and microwave popcorn bags and all of these strange elements. And then I wove in some of these examples from history. One thing I found by doing FOIA requests was that there was a dedicated program to surveil ethnic Chinese scientists in the United States in the 60s and 70s, and not just people who had close ties to the mainland, but like people who were ethnic Chinese from Malaysia or, were several generations out from China. And the legacy of that is that there is a lot of mistrust within the Chinese American community. There have been cases even more recently that were botched or mishandled. The Wenho Lee case back in the late 1990s was an espionage case of a researcher at Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory, but that was also botched. And so, there's a lot of mistrust there. And at the same time, the research force in the United States, a lot of it is foreign born. And, if the goal is really protecting innovation in America, then we have to figure out a way to deal with these technological tensions without seriously alienating people.
Yeah, it's such a difficult question because it's like you said, there's botched cases. I just remember this case, so I just brought it up. But like 2 weeks ago, an MIT professor, his name is Gongchen. I mean, he was just facing federal charges, right? For his hiding these payments he's taking from the Chinese Communist Party while working at MIT. Same thing. And I think we saw similar cases at Harvard. and elsewhere. And it's like you said, our university system is so deeply intertwined, not just on the research level, but also in terms of the amount of money that comes in from foreign students. Like the economic intertwinement is a really key part of the story here, which is why it's just so complicated to try and disentangle this. I guess, one of the interesting things, I think I heard you say this in a different interview you gave, which is that prosecuting, people for industrial espionage and more, it's kind of like the war on drugs. Like you can go after people, but that's not necessarily going to solve it. What does solving it look like? Because, at the end of the day, this is about pure competition. And so, like, what do you say, like, the core root or the issue is? I mean, I think it's much more, high level, which is that, in many ways, the previous iteration of Chinese espionage and peer competition with the U.S. was definitely based on just like straight up ripping and copying products, but it hasn't been that way now for quite some time. Like, they're very capable of creating, launching, and doing many of their own things, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the show. Just like, how do you think about that dynamic there?
Well, the case of Gongchen is the MIT scientist. He's actually a department chair. Is really an interesting one, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because the initial press release that DOJ or that prosecutors in Boston issued accused him of hiding this crazy amount of money. It was like $19 million, and was filled with pretty serious allegations. And then when the indictment came out, it turned out that the charges were more minor. And the situation there is that MIT has had this collaboration with this university in China, and that the $19 million was
it's like part of the research grant or something. Okay. Yeah.
So the MIT had this collaboration with a university in China. Gongchen was the lead scientist on it. And so, whether MIT should have had that collaboration is an interesting question that we need to ask. But what happens often is that there are these questionable relationships that develop, and then instead of dealing with the entity, or in this case, a university that's involved, you throw the individual under the bus. That happened in other cases that I looked at for my book. And so, we have this deeper problem that needs to be addressed probably through bigger policy changes. And just dealing with these low-level individuals is a little bit like arresting people off the street corner.
Yeah, what's really interesting when you're saying that is I actually completely agree with you. I didn't know the full, thing on the case, but you're right, which is that, okay, if that's the case, then like MIT needs to face some serious problems here. Same with Harvard. One of the things that go ahead. Yeah.
Well, and I don't even know if there was technology transferred in that case. It was a nanotech case. It's sensitive technology. So it's definitely worth asking those questions.
Right.
What I do know is that the charges against Gongchen, as when they came out, were involving lying to the FBI, which it's fairly easy to get somebody on that charge, and hiding money from a foreign bank account, as I recall. So.
Right. Right. I was just thinking in the context of what you said about Monsanto, which is that, yeah, they were desperately trying to enter the Chinese market. Like they would have done anything, I bet, in order to go in there. It was the CCP who was like, no, you're not coming in here. You're not going to run our agricultural sector. And this is actually something that they've done with a whole host of companies. And as you said, a lot of corporations were desperate to get into China. Only whenever they found out that they weren't going to be able to go, then they were like, okay, now like the government has to come and protect us.
Facebook.
So something Marshall and
Facebook
I
is
talk, Facebook is like the peak example. Something Marshall and I talk a lot about here, though, is incentives. So I'm actually curious, if you were going to look at it from like a drug war incentive or, and other more, wouldn't it just be easier to just rule it out for them? To say, no, like you guys aren't going to do business in China. This is something I've been thinking about for a long time. Like if you remove that as their ability let's say, especially in like strategic sectors, if we were to designate like tech, food is definitely one of them, and maybe a few others. I'm not proposing a total U.S. ban on business with China, maybe in different sectors. That would just change the dynamic there, because it's like you said, there does seem to be some hypocrisy at a base level.
Yeah, so there's a shift. The EU has been looking at designating surveillance technologies, including facial recognition and so forth, as export control eligible.
Mhm.
And in the US, I think we have fairly narrow use of export controls right now, but certain certain instances that have come up in China have certainly challenged that. And looking at like companies that have been working in Xinjiang, for example,
Yes.
companies, genetics companies, the tech companies, and I don't think these issues will continue to come up. And yeah, it's much more complicated than just Chinese companies are trying to insert their surveillance technology around the world, right? It's these corporate interests in all countries that are really, see China as this great market for their
Yeah.
products.
Yeah, and I think that's why, though, Sagar, to push back against my co-host a
Mm.
little bit, I don't think banning is actually the simpler answer, because
Mm.
in most of these cases, it's unclear what banning would actually mean. But also on a deeper level, the problem here is that this is so industry specific and sector by sector that at a certain point, it seems like the broader complaint is that you have a system where people need to make money and expand into markets. So at an underlying level, I'm not quite sure what legislation underlyingly changes that. But a broader question I want to ask you is, help us understand the state of the FBI from your perspective, because what I think is so interesting here is the narrative of what the FBI is and how it's perceived is just perpetually shifting. So in the 1960s, it's a bunch of goons, like actual, like straight,
Like
like
literal
actual,
goons.
like racist goons, like led by J. Edgar Hoover. They're tapping the Kennedys, they're tapping MLK, all sorts of excess during the Vietnam War era, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have the 1990s stuff. Then during the Trump era, interestingly enough, the pendulum swings a little bit. So then the FBI, I think because of James Comey and Trumpian politics, becomes a real cause of the center left. So now like books about the FBI really sell well there. So just help us understand where I mean this honestly, like where is the narrative right now? Like how should we understand the FBI? Because operationally it's not partisan, but it's very clear that both sides of the aisles, not to be whataboutist, but both sides of the aisle will reinterpret the FBI, its function, and whether it's good or bad based upon their own narratives. And the one thing I'll add to this too is that post-Capitol insurrection, the FBI is now deeply engaged in the follow-up and plans to surveil and engage people who are involved. And once again, I have no problem with that. But once again, like that's another clear indication of how these pendulums shift. So just help us understand the narrative of the FBI.
Yeah, it's true. We are in this very strange period, and we have been for much of the Trump administration, where people on the left feel all warm and fuzzy about the FBI. It's something I dealt with in the process of reporting my book. But look, I'm a reporter with the Intercept. We cover surveillance and we cover the intelligence community from this very critical perspective. And I spent a lot of time with intelligence agents for this book, particularly the lead FBI agent who worked on the case. He, is very giving of his time, which I really appreciated. But ultimately, it's not that the FBI was bad in the 1960s and is great today. There are certain systemic issues that have been around for decades that have improved somewhat, but that are still issues. One of them is diversity within the bureau, is particularly on these cases involving Chinese American scientists is an issue. It's also probably one of the reasons that so much of the intelligence involving the Capitol insurrection was overlooked. But I talked to Asian American agents who felt like they were really sidelined, and that they one guy told me that in some cases he was at one point his supervisor told him not to date other Asian American women because they could be trying to get information from him. And he was like, well, are you saying I just have to date white girls? So, I mean, this was a fairly recent conversation that gets at where some of the biases might be in these cases. But I think, whether the FBI is going after Capitol insurrectionists or going after people who targeted trade secrets of U.S. multinationals, or going after, so-called Black identity extremists, the issues are the same, right? We should not be using certain surveillance technologies when they're not justified. We shouldn't be using Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrants when it's not an issue of extreme national security. It's not like an immediate terror threat. And I think also, if you look back to the post 9/11 reaction, you had a legitimate threat that then provoked an overreaction, in some cases a wrong reaction, attention to the wrong areas. I can see parallels with what's happened with economic espionage and trade secrets theft from China, where you have a legitimate threat. It's a legitimate issue, but you have to deal with it in a way that isn't counterproductive.
So this is the part where I need to be an audience advocate and ask the question, which is almost certainly on most people's minds, which is like, okay, what about Christine Fang, who was the, and please correct me if I'm like mischaracterize this, but she was effectively a Chinese spy who pursued relationships with up and coming politicians in the United States, and like very clearly was part of that effort. So, for example, as I'm thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong, as you're bringing up the example of the Asian American agent who was told not to date Asian women, was the point there was the FBI's logic that, any Asian women who are trying to date you are probably going to be Chinese spies. So it's basically just easier for you just to date white women. So how do balance, right? So how do you, I'm just trying to think like, how do you balance this? Because what I definitely think is going to happen, you have, in the state of California, I'm pretty sure it was Barbara Boxer's driver who was, Chinese American, Diane Feinstein's driver was a Chinese spy. So what I feel is certainly going to happen, this is why you're right to highlight issues of discrimination, is I guarantee you the next time there is an Asian American woman in California politics who is maybe a little socially awkward or asks too many questions, people are going to say, hey, is this Christine Fang 2.0? So how should people just think about this? Because we're stuck between, because when we take one more step back, what makes this so hard is that this isn't 1950s jump under your desks because the nuclear bombs are going to fall. There actually is a genuine issue where things genuinely happen, and there have been politicians and institutions, education or governmental or otherwise, who have screwed up their security here. So how should we all just broadly think of this as people who are good faith and don't want to discriminate, but also don't want to be incredibly stupid as certain politicians were?
Well, first of all, I would separate straight up espionage, with political spying of the sort that you're talking about, from industrial espionage. They're sometimes lumped into the same category, but I think that stealing seeds from Monsanto is a different sort of issue. Yeah. And, even the U.S. government has tried to distinguish them and carve out this norm, which is disputed by some, that it is spying for political secrets is something that all nations do, whereas spying for industrial secrets is something that the U.S. doesn't do. That's disputed, but even the U.S. government makes that distinction. So, but then when you look actually at recent Chinese espionage cases, and I've written about a number of them, they're pretty diverse. So a number of some have involved Chinese Americans or Chinese nationals, as you mentioned, but there was also the case of Glenn Shriver, who was a recent college graduate in China, who, it's just like the details of this are so kind of cheesy and cinematic. And the FBI did actually make a very cheesy film about it. He was in Shanghai and he responded to an essay contest asking for an essay on the future of U.S. China relations, and was recruited by Chinese intelligence that way. And then they tried to groom him to apply to the CIA. He applied multiple times, I believe, and then he was caught. But there are several cases like that where it's the person who is not typically suspected. In this case, a young white guy who ends up being the target of Chinese intelligence. And I think one of the issues is that there has been an kind of fundamental misunderstanding and even underestimation of the capacity of Chinese intelligence services. So they're not a monolith. There are several different intelligence agencies like there are here, and they're very sophisticated. I mean, they rolled up the CIA's network in China and shot some people in broad daylight a few years ago. So, I think there are multiple tactics that are being tried, and many different types of people who are being targeted. So looking specifically at one type of person is really not productive in that case. That is a trope. That's an idea that goes back decades within the intelligence agencies. I talked about this in the book, that there was even a kind of name for this theory that justified profiling people, but the evidence just doesn't really bear it out at this point.
That's an excellent point. It's funny. I was thinking about that story the other day about, remember, like right when Trump was elected, there were all these stories about how good the KGB was and all this. And then, I mean, the Chinese are the ones who basically destroyed the entire like CIA network within a single month, which was, I mean, from an intelligence perspective, was actually like crazy impressive. And I remember reading a little bit about how it all went down, and I was like, that's insane. I want to pick up on something that you were talking about there, which is industrial espionage being different than state, I guess, spycraft in the think of political espionage. And I'm not sure I even agree. Well, I think I agree with it from a U.S. perspective, because what you pointed out there was that earlier in the show about how, American companies fundamentally do not act at the behest of the U.S. state. Whereas like Chinese companies do. Like what was that company called in the book? DBN, right? Is that what it is?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So DBN
right?
is
the Chinese agricultural company.
Is the Chinese agriculture, which tried to steal the seeds. I mean, like DBN is being tasked with something which would be beneficial to CCP and the made 2025 plan, like all of that, like all like fits together. And so from that perspective, I kind of think industrial espionage, when the Chinese do it, is like kind of a tool of their statecraft, because it's very much a part of their state capitalist strategy in order to dominate in key sectors, which are geostrategic for them. Like they think about the arms of their companies and others as tools of their state. I'm not saying the U.S. doesn't do it either, but there's a reason I think that we refer to our stuff as soft power, when I don't think that they really have that concept over there. So, or maybe I'm wrong. Like, tell me whether I am.
With DBN, the agricultural company that Robert Mueller worked for, and the company that sent him and others to the U.S. to try to steal seeds, with the goal of bringing them back to China to reverse engineer them. I don't think it was so much that DBN was tasked by the Chinese government. I think in a lot of cases, it's that there are these incentives to make technological breakthroughs, and companies know that the government's going to look the other way. And so, I think with some more strategic technology, with some dual use technologies that get closer to military work, that it is a more direct tasking. But in this case, Robert Mueller, as far as I can tell, did not have any contact with intelligence agencies.
Right.
And he was this kind of
But like
hapless.
he was a delegate, right? He was a delegate to that. I remember reading that he faked his way or whatever as a delegate when Xi Jinping visited Iowa. So I'm like, well, I mean, like, what are we supposed to think?
Yeah. So that's an interesting scene in the book. So Xi Jinping at that point was next in line to be leader, but was not yet. Had organized this trip to Iowa with this big agricultural delegation. And, the governor, Terry Branstad, who later became the ambassador to China, is there. Right. All the big ag companies are there. And Robert Mueller takes the name tag of somebody else on the delegation and sneaks into the event. And I don't really know. I talked quite a bit to the FBI agent who investigated this, as well as to prosecutors. And I actually think that he was just there trying to make connections. There was this other woman who figured in the case was there as well. And no one could really figure out, the FBI tailed him from the minute that he flew in for that particular meeting, but no one really figured out what he was up to on that particular trip. There were other scenes in the book that were much clearer. And one of the reasons I chose this case was because the FBI had bugged Robert and his colleagues' cars for 2 years. And so I had whole chunks of dialogue of what they were saying to each other in the car. And I thought this is just really a wonderful opportunity to tell a case scene by scene in detail. Because I think so often we don't get that level of insight into what happened.
So as we're nearing the end here, we're talking about the U.S. government, how it acts, and how the Chinese government acts. And you had a quote in a different episode, which I thought was incredibly helpful for understanding this, which is, in times of tension, Cold War historians believe there's this mirroring that goes on. We start to behave like the enemy, and that's the big risk. And I feel like that is the moment we're in now. So I'd love for you to expand a little bit on that idea, but I just want to get to the concept of, is it possible there's such thing as good mirroring? So copying your enemy or rival, because that could be a good thing, but there could also be bad mirroring. So for example, it's entirely possible that during the 1930s, and I'm not trying to literally draw an exact, this is like Hitler all over again. It's a little more complicated than that, obviously, but during the 1930s, an enemy/rival was Nazi Germany. And the thing that enemy and rival was doing was rearming incredibly aggressively. So from my perspective, actually, and during that time of tension, the proper response was to copy what the enemy was doing. It wasn't to say, hey, let's invade other countries and take the Sudetenland for ourselves, but it was to say, hey, we should also be increasing our investment in in planes, tanks, the Navy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we distinguish between the idea that sometimes playing in the game of international politics requires responding to moves, but then how do we recognize that there is the idea of we could just go too far the other direction? So it'd be helpful to understand that dichotomy there.
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel. It reminds me a little bit of the Zuckerberg argument that if you regulate U.S. tech, China will win, which of course he arrived at that argument after years of, displaying Xi Jinping's book on his desk and going for runs in Tiananmen Square, which nobody runs in Tiananmen Square. It's slippery and he would fall.
When I was there, it was really cold. Yeah.
It's nowhere to jog.
Yeah.
So, unlike in the 30s, there is, let me think how to rephrase this.
Let me operationalize a little bit to make this a little more specific, because my point here is one could, for example, read or listen to that quote and conclude that what you're saying is, well, when China bans, and maybe you oppose this, but when China says American companies cannot come into China, especially in the digital software space. So for example, China just banned Clubhouse, the audio app, from actually occurring there. any claim that the US should reciprocate or should also say, well, if American companies can't compete in China fairly, then Chinese companies can't compete fairly here. From my perspective, and there's a nuanced debate we could have about that on a different episode, but my point is someone could read your quote and just sum up the position that there needs to be dual capacity. So if China gets in, we could get in, vice versa. Someone could say that making that demand is just me saying we should just copy China and mirror, and that's bad. So I'm just trying to get to how do we, because I think I love how you brought up the Mark Zuckerberg argument, because in many ways it's sort of bad faith, it's political PR. I'm just trying to get to like, no, but seriously, like, how do we think about this? Because yeah, it would be totally wrong to say, hey, like China supports its company, so now we need to like, have the state take over everything.
Yeah, we should own everything.
Yeah,
it's like,
the response isn't to say like, you know what, Mark Cuban took down the national anthem, nationalize the NBA and make him do X, Y, and Z. That's not the point here. So how should we think about this?
No, there have been calls for reciprocity, as it's called with China for years, in everything from visas to for journalists. As a journalist myself, I had the experience of waiting over a year for a visa, and that, I had colleagues who had much worse experiences. And of course, people who were then kicked out last year. And that's something the US finally took up under the Trump administration. But there have also been calls for reciprocity in the area of industrial espionage and in kind of targeted sanctions. And the Trump administration did try some of those strategies, and I actually think some of them were a good idea. But the problem is that it came with all the other noise of the Trump administration. So like a trade war that is started ostensibly because of industrial espionage, and then like now we're closing the Houston consulate because of industrial espionage, and just this intense flare up of racism as well. And it was all of that. I think that those comments that you mentioned, I said that amid all of the craziness of last spring, when China had just kicked out a lot of journalists. The US was retaliating by kicking out Chinese journalists. There was this tit for tat. Meanwhile, the pandemic was escalating. And there is a real risk of things spiraling out of control.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. It's like what Marshall said. I mean, I'm definitely a reciprocity caller. I'll own up to it. I have been public about it for a while. And I mean, with the Clubhouse thing, it just seems so, as I understand it, the day Clubhouse was banned was because the night before there was a room about Xinjiang and on the concentration camps there, and the way the leaders were treated.
There were quite a lot of rooms over the weekend. I think I was I was the only China journalist who didn't spend my whole weekend on Clubhouse.
Well, I actually had the privilege yesterday when this was all going down. I was on Clubhouse, and I actually got to talk to Ai Weiwei. And I asked him, I said, Ai Weiwei, for people who don't know, he's a Nobel Prize winner. He was an artist in China as a dissident who was imprisoned. I think he lives somewhere in Europe now. But I asked him, I said, Ai Weiwei, what do you think the only way to change Chinese behavior is? And he said, you could talk, I'm paraphrasing. He's like, you could talk about human rights and that all day long. All they understand is profit. All you can do is target profit. And so when I think about reciprocity, like in this context, like Clubhouse, an American company, just got valued at $1 billion, got like 6 million users. I think it's going to take off. I mean, it's banned in its infancy almost immediately in China because of not just Xinjiang. I'm sure they also look at it from a tech perspective. And then I look at, our market. We have TikTok, which is a ByteDance controlled company, which is, exists and operates in China, where 1/4 of American citizens are. And I just say, I don't think that's right. I mean, I do not think it is right that this company, which has and easily could be, there's no such thing as a subpoena. Like if they were like, give us your records, they're like, okay, they literally have to, or they can't exist. And their CEO, Jiang Zemin, I mean, he has already done activities at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party that we allow, from a fairness perspective, this app, which look, this isn't a judgment on the app. I'm saying this is a Chinese controlled app which is a penetrated high levels in our marketplace, and we don't even get the chance to try and do the opposite over there. It just
I
doesn't
agree
seem
with you
fair.
on TikTok. So this is something I've reported on myself, and there's also there's a lot of evidence that they have censored.
Oh, that's right.
So
on
they've
Xinjiang as well.
censored
Right.
posts related to
Right.
the camps in Xinjiang. They've censored posts by so-called like ugly people. I mean, it's a problematic app, but at the same time, the solution is not to give it to a U.S. tech company.
Oh,
maybe
I agree. Right.
Maybe that's part of the solution, but we have to have a much more holistic approach. And so, like, one of the issues you see in my book with the Monsanto case is that the entire case was brought ostensibly to protect innovation in the United States, but the seed industry is a highly concentrated industry that's controlled by just a few companies.
Right.
And even in the course of my reporting, Monsanto was acquired by Bayer. So by the end of the case, it was no longer even an American company. So you have this irony of the US government expending massive resources trying to protect the IP of an American company, and the company just leaves its borders. So when you look at the issue of Chinese technology companies and the concern that they could pass on data to the Chinese government, I think we also have to look at how the industry is developing other places, because there's massive problems with the tech industry here. And, if we leave it completely unregulated, we're not going to be much better off.
And this is why I'm
Great
glad that we're framing this conversation, at least on the China side, as being about reciprocity, because there's entirely a conversation to be had about U.S. data privacy and American companies. But I get very frustrated when, and once again, there's an entirely legitimate case to be made against the way the Trump administration handled the TikTok ban. But the question of Facebook and Google's data is entirely different than the question of reciprocity when it comes to American and Chinese tech companies. So to a certain degree, it frustrates me when those issues are conflated. I think it's possible to argue that we have a reciprocity issue with China, and also say that on the domestic side, we have American technology companies that need to be regulated in different ways as well too. So that's important. So to take us out, I just want to ask this. It's been basically a year almost since the book came out. The paperback is out now. As you referenced at the start, it's not great to drop a book right before the coronavirus. I'm sure the book may have turned out slightly differently in certain respects. What has changed in the past year, or has advanced the narratives or ideas you were interested in?
Yeah, to go back to your point that you just made, I agree with you that the two are conflated. The issue of Chinese tech companies being too closely connected to the Chinese government, and then also the issue of reciprocity. But the issues that with industrial espionage, they are often conflated by companies in the industry, in like the seed industry, for example. So what's changed in the past year? Well, a lot.
One is that the silver Zoom,
literally everything.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one is that people stormed the Capitol in part because they thought that China had submarines off our shores. And
was that QAnon? Was that part of QAnon?
That was one post that I saw. There were so many variations on the theme of
JFK Jr.'s alive. It's a whole new world.
There is so many different variations on the theme of China did all of this and we need to stop them from stealing the election. So that was not an issue at the moment that my book came out. But the general discussion around industrial espionage has intensified. The U.S. closed the Houston consulate in July and gave the issue of industrial espionage as a reason for doing that. Also just in general, it's not just the Trump administration and concerns about the pandemic that have escalated U.S. China tensions. I mean, China's also encroached severely on Hong Kong. There's been a lot of advocacy and activism around the camps in Xinjiang, and a lot more has come out on what is actually happening there in the past year. So that's becoming a more urgent issue. And the Chinese government in general has used the cover of the pandemic to tighten control. So once normal business resumes, it will be very interesting to see how industrial espionage kind of plays into this mix.
My last question on industrial espionage is really more of just what do we know about Chinese espionage on the vaccine process? Because
and not just China, basically anyone, because every country on earth is trying to figure this out. That must be the ground zero for everything we're talking about.
I think that the timeline was Russia, then China, and then Pfizer, right? I believe that's what it actually was. But yeah, that must have been maybe one of the biggest industrial espionage efforts in modern memory. What do we know generally about it? Not just China, but I'm sure Russia was involved. I'm sure Iran, like whomever.
Sure, we're doing something to certain degrees too.
Yeah, and so that gets to the central issue. I mean, I really believe that the vaccine rollout should not be controlled by a few big corporations, or nationalized in the case of China. It's problematic that people in the U.S. Or, for example, Israel are getting the vaccine before people in the developing world. I'm in Europe right now, and the government where I am was very slow to get the vaccine, and so it's really not being rolled out as quickly. And I just find that entire process mind-boggling. But definitely, each side is trying to figure out what the other is doing.
Yeah. Well, it's been a fascinating episode, Mara. Thank you so much for joining us. Marshall and I literally loved the book. I didn't even know you, and I put it on my best books of the year and all that. So we were really glad that you could stop by. Release of the paperback. We've got it up on our bookshop. Highly recommend that everybody go and buy it there. Support Mara, and you support the show. So thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's been great.
Thanks for coming.